Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you're watching or listening. My name is Caleb Glick. I'm a lawyer here in the great state of Texas with the Calhoun School of Law to bring you a lot of information plenty of bad folks would rather you not have. Today, ladies and gentlemen, I have quite the exciting lecture planned out for you, but simply, I'm going to be pleading my case, my generation and previous generations, and hopefully for the insight of future generation, I will be pleading the case for free market, laissez-faire economics. So real quick, let's address how this pertains to law. Why in the world is a lecturer for the Calhoun School of Law, not economics, addressing economics? And this is a question that's actually best answered by a lecture we did about 2 months ago when we discussed Thomas Jefferson's reading list that he provided to his nephew and then to a well, I can't remember the individual's name particularly, but he was asking, hey, I want to become a lawyer. I want to become an attorney. What would be the reading list that you would suggest for me to become well prepared, well learned, well knowledged in the field of law? So that way I'm not just some oil salesman who claims to be a lawyer but actually not know anything talking about, not know what I'm talking about. And in the list of books that Jefferson replied with, he had books on husbandry, he had books on mathematics, Greek and Roman history, European history. He had suggestions about science, physics, so on and so forth. And then in the law specific section, there were maybe two or three books. And he said the reason for that is laws are built and constructed not to just exist within themselves, but to protect and to facilitate these other fields. And there's no way that you can effectively apply a law or be a litigator, or excuse me, a legislator. You can't be a litigator or a legislator of that area of laws if you don't understand what that area is. So that's a heavy task, that's a heavy burden, but that's also why you have specialties and well, specialties in the fields of law, because there is such an abundant amount of information that you have to consume so that way you are aptly understood in that field of law. That way when you go to apply the laws and you see certain jargon that's written within that law, you know how to apply it to your specific area and provide the best representation for yourself or for a client. So with my specialty, I specialize in constitutional and tax law, which means my daily activities pertain to challenging the constitutionality of proposed bills, of proposed laws, of drafted legislation, so on. And then on the tax side, it's fairly similar to the constitutional aspect, but more honed in on taxes. So, can the U.S. Congress, can the Texas legislature levy taxes on these certain assets? Really focused in on particular Texas tax statutes, Texas tax codes, how they apply to the Texas Constitution, and then with the U.S. tax laws and how they apply to the U.S. Constitution. A lot of my daily activity has to deal with economics. It has to deal with this supposed promise of a free market that is inherently established, well, not inherently, but has subsequently become established by the Republican constitutional form of government, guaranteed in both the Texas and U.S. Constitution. U.S. Constitution is Article 4, Section 4. Texas Constitution is Article 1, Section 2. Republican form of government, constitutional republic. So that's how economic comes into play here. And economics, like contract law, very intimately interwoven into our daily lives. Every transaction you do will at some point involve some sort of currency exchange or, well, monetary exchange, labor exchange, anything of the sort. That's all counted within economics. So I'm going to be pleading my case as to why I have found in my studies, I have found in my readings, that a capitalist, laissez-faire, free market, no regulations, no restrictions whatsoever, is the best market and serves the highest interest for all individuals. And I'm going to start it out with this. The only thing you can trust every man to serve is his own self-interest. Caleb, doesn't that go against the idea that you just said, that capitalism serves everybody's highest interest? Well, no, because what is in the individual's self-interest? Garnering resources, attaining wealth, expanding profits. All of that doesn't just come out of thin air. Not in a capitalist system. Not in a laissez-faire system. In a free market system, that profit, that wealth accumulation is achieved, is attained whenever the individual provides a product or a service that is desirable to others. So desirable that those others in the free market are willing to exchange an equivalent amount of a resource. Whether that be a fiat currency. Fiat currency is just an economic term that means you have something of value, but it's really difficult to transport, like 100 head of cattle. So instead of waiting for the 100 head of cattle to arrive to this person's land that you're trading with, here's $1,000. Now that's absolutely nowhere near the actual fiat currency ratio, but here's $1,000. This $1,000 is like an IOU. This represents that 100 head of cattle. So that way, if you come to me, I'll give you 100 head of cattle for that $1,000. Or if you want to take that $1,000 and go and trade it with someone else, you can do that too. That $1,000 represents 100 head of cattle. That's what a fiat currency is. It's merely a convenience. That's it. It does not, in and of itself, have value. The US dollar does not, in and of itself, have value. The yen, the euro, none of these currencies have innate value. They are merely representative. They're IOU sheets. You can think of them like a cashier's check. Not gold, not silver, it's not anything. It's only representative of those things. So serving your self-interest, every individual serving their own self-interest in a free market system requires the individual, not necessarily, you don't have to immediately run to this competing for your right to life argument, because you don't. You don't have to offer a product or a service to be able to live. You don't have to go and make millions upon millions of dollars to just live. You have a right to life, God-given right to life. If you want comfort, you want luxury, that's when you have to compete. Within a capitalist system, the money, the wealth, the resources does not just show up out of thin air. A product or a service, a desired product or service, has to be provided. A product so desired that consumers or transactors are willing to exchange for that product with an equal amount of another resource. So the argument I hear from my generation is, oh, well, exploiting the consumer, exploiting the laborer, exploiting the worker. No, because both parties are getting something out of it. The most direct example, what you're watching this lecture on right now. You don't have to have this device to be successful. You don't have to have this device to come up with your own product or service to attain and achieve wealth. But you desired it. You desired the product. And imagine how, well, you probably don't have to imagine. Imagine how unhappy you would be without having this product. Imagining that you can connect with the entire world in half a second and not having access to that. Well, now you do. In exchange for an equivalent amount of resources. So no one's being exploited. No one's being lambasted. No one's being bent over. Both parties benefit. You get an awesome device. They get an accumulation of wealth. If you don't like that, The best way to punish a product, service, or business in a free market system is to simply not buy their product or their service. You don't get to do that in any other system. We got to see that recently. We'll talk about that more here in a second. Because first, I want to preface all of this. If you want a thorough explanation, and I'm saying very comprehensive and thorough, if you read this one book, this one economic book, it's not written by me, so this is not an advertisement or oh, what do you want to call it, an infomercial. If you want to read just one book and have a thorough, complete, comprehensive understanding of economics, Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, absolutely recommend. You'll have to dedicate probably a month and a half to reading it. But if you only have time for one book, if you don't want to go chasing answers in all of these different pages by all of these different authors, he is by far the best. He's provided the best expose on economics. If you want to get into more simplistic, maybe don't necessarily mind chasing all the answers in multiple different pages, I recommend reading anything by Ludwig von Mises. Ludwig, Ludwig, von, von, Mises, Mises. Friedrich Hayek is another good one. Hayek spelled Hayek. Anything by Milton Friedman, anything by Thomas Sowell, anything by, oh, there's another one. He escapes memory now. But those are all phenomenal authors. Very, very conclusive, very comprehensive in their explanations of economics. Strongly recommend all of those authors. And if you want to play devil's advocate, consider what the opposition to free market economics is. Go ahead and pick up a copy of the Communist Manifesto. Personally, I would recommend it. Not because it's in any way convincing, but because Marx and Engels both admit the downfalls of their proposed economic system. They didn't really coin it, but their explanation of a communitarian economic provides some insight as to why it hasn't worked and can't work. They admit that it can't work without certain qualifiers. So if you want just one novel, comprehensive, complete book, explanation on economics, Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations. Okay. So now let's get into the actual core principles of economics. And I know this is going to be probably a longer lecture. Not as long as the Texas or the Civil War, the War of Northern Aggression, about slavery lecture, but it's probably going to be pretty close. Or the self-defense, that's the one I was thinking of, the Texas self-defense lecture. The first core tenet of economics: there is nothing valuable except for labor. And this is actually something that all systems, all schools of thought of economics agree upon. Marx, Mises, no matter where you look in economics, in economic literature or academia, they all agree on this singular principle that labor is the true value, is the only valuable resource, is the, all capitalized letters, valuable resource. Why? Because it's not replenishable. Time is limited. Manpower is limited. We don't know how much gold there is on the planet, but it's bountiful enough. It's not replenishable, obviously, but there's enough of it that it deflates the value of gold. What really makes gold valuable is the difficulty in finding it, mining it, and keeping it. Something else that plays into that appreciation of the value of gold is its longevity, its endurance. You can throw it out in the ocean, and 500 years from now, it's going to look just like the day, or it's going to look like it did. It's going to look just like it did the day you threw it into the ocean. Other than that, gold doesn't really have a value. All of these things that we tend to associate with having value don't have value. The only resource that has value in economics is labor. And it's hard to quantify labor. More often than not, it will in some way include time, because time is not replenishable. Some argue it's manpower, that's the other variable adding to its value. Some say it's effort. Those are somewhat synonymous. Point being, labor is not replenishable. Labor is very limited. Labor is very difficult to get. It is the only valuable resource. So now that we know what the actual true resource is, the only valuable resource is, how do we utilize it? Free market economics says, let the individual decide that. Let a competitive market decide that. The true value of certain labor. Other schools, virtually every other school, says, let the government decide. Let the government universalize the value of labor, the standards of labor. What we know for certain throughout all of history is regardless the government structure, anything government touches, it destroys. The founders in particular, the founders of the US, these United States, in particular, routinely acknowledge that anything government touches, it destroys, which is why you give it the least amount of power and leave the most amount of power in the hands of the citizens. So that way the citizens, like those in the school of thought for free market, can determine not just the value of their labor, but how they're going to be governed. Remember that key phrase, the just powers of government come from the consent of the governed. That's a contract. That's not a declaration of divine rule. That's not a declaration of supreme authority going to the government. That is in fact saying the citizens ultimately determine when they are and when they are not to be governed. Well, Caleb, that would just lead to anarchy. Maybe. But like Jean-Jacques Rousseau had said to Mr. Hobbes, well, Mr. Hobbes, if man is fallen, if man is cruel and unfair, how would it naturally follow to then give man authority over his fellow man? If he cannot be trusted to conduct his own affairs, why allow him or trust him to conduct the affairs of others? So it may sound like on paper that that's anarchy, but in reality, there's no other modus to operate. You have to go with that principle if you wish to be consistent, if you wish to be logically honest. So anything the government touches, it destroys, which means you definitely do not want to let the government anywhere near labor or economics, because those are the lifelines. Labor, of course, being how you provide for your attaining wealth, your attaining resource. That, of course, plays directly into your pursuit of property and happiness, which then facilitates your practice and exercise of liberty. How these play out. So don't let the government anywhere near determining the value of labor or how that labor is going to be allocated or distributed or redistributed. We've already discussed this earlier. Currencies are for convenience. They're not valuable. They don't have innate value. The US dollar is no more valuable than the paper it is printed on. Currencies are merely representative. They are fiats. They are IOUs. They are not labor, to use a very apt, actual valuable resource. Dollars, yen, euro, all of these currencies are established by the government or by the governments of their regions to make exchange and transactions more convenient. It is a very bad idea, very unwise, shown time and time and time and time and time again throughout history, allowing the government to determine the printing of that currency, the minting of that currency, the value of that currency, Never been a good idea. Never been wise. Because then, of course, you have what you have today, where the government says, oh, we want to fund these projects. The citizens don't really care to fund the projects. That doesn't matter. We control the press, so we're just going to print as many dollars as we want. That, of course, takes away the buying power of your dollar, the dollars that you possess, because now there are more dollars in circulation. So what happens when you assign more of one thing to a singular portion of a truly valuable resource like labor? That currency, that dollar, becomes less valuable because it takes more of that dollar to equal that same amount of labor. So $1 for one labor is a far more valuable dollar than $16 per one labor. Right. You're inflating the ratio, which devalues the currency. On to the next principle. We've talked about gold. I think we mentioned silver. Gold and silver, like fiat currencies, aren't in and of themselves valuable. They have qualities, they have aspects that others desire, but in reality, the part that makes them valuable is the difficulty of finding, mining, keeping, collecting, purifying those minerals. And that's the same principle that applies for all kinds of jewels, all kinds of metals. Of course, their qualities, their properties, their whether you want to talk about conductibility, whether you want to talk about malleability, if you want to talk about, oh, there's another quality, it has to do with shimmer. But regardless of the qualities, the part that actually makes them valuable is the difficulty, the amount of manpower and time that you have to allocate, or labor, in order to collect, maintain, and then, of course, exchange that good, that material good. So things like gold, metals like silver, metals like gold and silver, don't have innate value. What they do have is historical records behind them. A lot of people throughout time really like and really desire gold and silver, which means in the future times, the US dollar is so inflated that it takes 50,000 of those dollars to equal 1 ounce of gold. That gold, that singular ounce of gold, kind of a bittersweet irony, that singular ounce of gold is easier to trade and transact and transport than $50,000. 50,000 green slips of paper. So the level of convenience has inverted on itself. It's now easier, more direct, more transparent to just transact with the ounce of gold than carrying around 50,000 green slips of paper. The part that makes gold, precious metals like gold and silver, even copper, valuable is the desire that other people have for them. And what plays additionally into the value of that is how difficult the labor, the manpower, and the time applied, or how difficult the task is of finding labor to collect those resources, keep them, maintain them, and then transact them. So what about in a free market when an individual tries to monopolize? When an individual tries to collect 100% of any sector in a free market? A great litmus test, and I think it was John Locke who said this, when a free market is no longer practicing free market ideas, where competition is no longer permitted, is by asking this principle, by begging this principle. The rights of one individual end where the infringement on another's rights begins. So with a monopoly in a free market, is it truly a monopoly, or do they just provide a superior product or service? Are you allowed to go into that free market and compete? Are there any regulations that you have to comply with that that monopoly doesn't have to comply, or that didn't exist when the business was initiated. That's when you can determine free market versus something like Keynesian economics. Keynesian wasn't quite a communitarian economist, but he was pretty close. Monopolies are not inherently bad. Monopolies that are bad are those that then go on and coerce, inveigle, coax governing authorities to legislate unconstitutional, illegitimate laws and regulations that up and coming competition has to comply with. Things like labor unions. Yeah, probably didn't expect that one. We can get into labor unions in another video because that warrants an entirely different hour-long lecture just discussing labor unions. But all these different regulations, all of these different requirements that these other businesses didn't have to implement and comply with at their formation, those businesses are now utilizing unconstitutional, illegitimate power to suppress competition. That's not capitalism. That's not free market. That's not laissez-faire. That's the exact opposite. That is Keynesian. That is communitarian. That is socialized, communized economics. Whenever you introduce the government into the free market in any way, shape, or form, that is no longer a free market. So monopolies in and of themselves are not bad, because in a free market, that means you have a really good product. You have a really good service. By the way, it is virtually an impossible feat to capture 100% of a sector of any market. It is very difficult unless you have the assistance of a government. But again, once you have the assistance of the government, once you introduce the government into economic control, you no longer have capitalistic economics. You no longer have laissez-faire economics. You no longer have free market and competition. But you don't blame the monopoly, just like you don't blame the provider of a firearm to a murderer for the murder. Just because the tool is there, just because the tool is provided, doesn't mean you blame the provider of the tool. You blame the person who used the tool. Don't blame the monopoly. Don't blame the business for leveraging or utilizing its resources. Rather, blame the government. The government knows what is and what isn't constitutional. They disregard it anyway. For what? Their own self-interest. That's the only thing you can absolutely, with 100% certainty, trust every single person on the planet to do, to serve their own best interest. Which is why this phrase that we keep seeing time and time and time and time again in the Anti-Federalist Papers is just so pertinent, not only to our government, but to all areas of law. If only men were angels. That's why you can't ever trust, why you can't ever bestow upon government any power, implied or ambiguous. Everything has to be directly delineated. Any action taken outside of that course, any action taken outside of those permissions, is to be nullified and disobeyed. And the governments both of Texas and the U.S. have very clear guidelines. They choose to obfuscate, that they choose to completely disobey. In a free market, in a Republican, in a constitutional Republican type of government, just like in a free market, the best way to punish a bad politician, a bad business, a bad corporation, to not support them. in a communitarian, socialist, Marxist economic framework or government structure, you don't get that choice. You aren't assured good quality, you're assured one quality. And whether you like it or not, you're going to be forced to subsidize it under the guise of the common good, the greater good. So if you don't like how government is going now, if you don't like how economics is going now, you're really going to hate it when the government has 100% control over both economics and, of course, who can be bought by the monopolies. So when we hear about these monopolies buying politicians, paying for their campaigns, don't punish the monopoly for the downfalls, for the inadequacies of the politician, because the politician knows the rules. They're choosing to take the bribe anyway. Punish the politician. Punish the government so that the monopoly no longer has a reason to try to buy politicians, to try to bribe the government. Don't punish the person who provided the tool. Punish the person who used the tool. The monopoly provided the bribe. The politician took it. The politician levied it. The politician was ultimately the one who, if not wrote, sponsored the unconstitutional legislation to further protect that monopoly. So the system we have now obviously is not a free market capitalist system, though it's under the disguise of that, under the veiled promise of that. But the problem isn't with the monopolies. The problem isn't with the corporations and the businesses. The problem is with the government exercising powers it explicitly does not have. Take away and strip the government of those powers, and all of a sudden these monopolies don't write as big of checks to campaigns. Because now the incentive is lower. And you, right now, have more say, have a heavier pool in that result than you would if you were to give the government complete control over economics and say we need to punish the capitalist, we need to punish the entrepreneur because he makes $100 million every year. You get to vote out the person who was bribed. You get to censure him or her. You get to determine the legislation that prevents or prohibits his or her actions that led to his bribe. You get to do that. Whenever the government becomes the ultimate say, whenever the government becomes the arbiter of who is too big to fail or the necessary worker, just like what happens in communitarian economics and governments, whether you like the product or service or not, you're going to be forced to subsidize it. That's the big distinction between a capitalist, laissez-faire, free market system and a communitarian, communist, socialist system. In communism, sure, you have a product, you have a service, and you're guaranteed that product or service. But at what time and at what quality? And these products and services, again, don't just appear out of thin air. They are provided by laborers. So are you willing to enslave doctors, lawyers, mechanics, pilots, so that way these products and services can be provided to you? Are you willing to advocate for that? That's a moral question you need to ask yourself. And if you are willing to advocate for slaving people, well then, what makes you any different? How are you immune? Maybe the doctors and lawyers will want to enslave you. The main distinction between capitalism and communism isn't about workers' rights or laborers or serving a common good. The only difference, both parties, both schools agree that labor is the ultimate valuable resource. The only difference is that in a capitalist system, the laborer determines the value of their labor, and in a communitarian system, the government determines the value of labor. Another agreement that neither side likes to concede, by the way. Both capitalist and both capitalist and communist are communitarian. So communitarian includes communist, socialist, Marxist, protectionist, mercantilist. Both schools fail on a similar ground, but for different reasons. When I say that, both schools require people to just follow the rules. What you'll hear from both sides as well, we don't have a purely capitalist system, which is true. And then when you provide examples of communist or socialist or Marxist nations, the opposition says, well, those aren't truly communist, which is also true. But what we have to realize is both of these schools admit that their systems are not perfect, that they are not infallible. Marx admits, Engels admits in the Communist Manifesto that in order for their system to work, in order for their economic plan to work, you have to take away the person's identity, their family, their religion, their ambition. Because if you don't, that's their self-interest. And they start serving that before the common good, before the greater common good. And when you do that, that's when you have individual incentives. That's when you have individual motivations, individual ambitions, and then you have discordance. You have dissent on what exactly is the common greater good. So you have to take away family, religion, identity, beliefs, everything. You have to make mankind inhuman for communism to work. That's admitted by that school of thought. How does capitalism fail on that similar front? The same thing the Anti-Federalists said. If men were angels, we wouldn't need government at all. In a free market, it requires a common principality, a common moral framework. Just like atoms, just like, oh, who was it? There was someone else we just recently discussed. If you don't have that cohesion, you will have individuals that insert themselves into a free market and begin practicing abhorrent ideas, producing abhorrent products and services. Well, who defines abhorrent? Nobody can, because it's a free market. The moment you provide that definition, you now have a limitation, which means you no longer have a free market. So the only thing that we get to weigh, the only aspect that we get to weigh is which poison are we going to pick? Do you wish to determine your value, or do you wish to determine the value of your labor? Or do you want a government to do it? Will you confront reality and the most consistent aspect of human nature? That is, we all serve our own self-interest first and foremost? Or are you going to impose a common greater good? And we've talked about this in a previous lecture. Both systems can provide for peace. Both systems can provide for cohesion. The question is, how do you want to maintain that peace? In the communitarian government, it requires coercion and force. In a competitive capitalist system, peace is maintained through competition and coordination. Competition obviously being whoever has the best product or service then attains wealth. Coordination being we all agree not to infringe on anybody else's right to compete in the free market. May the best man win. Everyone starts off equally. Can't remember exactly who said this. It was one of the founders, one of the framers. We all start off on equal grounds that we can become as unequal as possible. That obviously does not mean we start on equal governance so that way we can then leverage our resources to get favoritism from the government. That's not by any stretch of the imagination what they meant. They meant we all start on equal grounds governmentally. The laws are applied equally and fairly across the board, regardless who you are. So that way, in that free system, you can utilize your talents and your unique abilities to become as unequal as possible. Not to garner extra rights, not to get public emoluments, not to get favoritism, but to be as unequal compared to your fellow citizens as possible. And that's my case. In short, labor is the only truly valuable resource. You have two schools of thought, not three, two. There we go. You have two schools of thought: capitalism, communitarianism. Capitalism allows you to determine the value of your labor. Communitarianism allows the government to determine the value of your labor. You have to choose. Are you going to recognize the reality, the most consistent nature of human nature, that being we serve our self-interest first and foremost? Or are you going to coerce mankind into serving a common greater good at all expense? Those are your two schools of thought. You have to choose one. And if you hate that monopolies by politicians and corrupt the government, then your problem isn't with the capitalist. Your problem isn't with the entrepreneur. It's the politician who took the bribe. Take away that position of authority, and all of a sudden, that entrepreneur has no reason to invest in bribing that politician. Blame the bribed, not the briber. He's serving his self-interest. The politician is serving his self-interest. You can punish this one. You can't punish this one. Well, the best way to punish this one is to not buy his products or services. This one, you can actually reprimand with law. There are your choices. And always remember that. Remember that labor is the only truly valuable resource. And in a free market, you determine the value of your labor. In a communitarian system, the value of your labor is determined for you. Let's see if we can put that more succinctly. In a free market, you determine the value of your labor. In a communitarian market, the value of your labor is determined for you. And that's my case. If you have any disagreements, and I'm sure there will be plenty down in the comments, go ahead and post them down in the comments. If there's a topic you'd like me to cover in a future lecture, also post those down in the comments, because the entire purpose of the Calhoun School of Law is to provide you with the necessary skills and information to combat any sort of lawfare that will be waged against you, your loved ones, or your hard-earned property. So please, if you have any questions at all, any arguments, so on and so forth, post them down in the comments. Excellent. So my name is Caleb Glick. I'm a lawyer here in the great state of Texas with the Calhoun School of Law to bring you a lot of information that plenty of bad folks would rather you not have. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and if not, while you're down in the comments, go ahead and let me know how I can do better, so I can best serve that purpose of helping you. I hope you'll have a wonderful day, and I'm not sure what the topic for the next lecture is going to be, but I'll do my best to make it as informative and entertaining as this one, if not more so. Regardless of the topic of the next lecture, Till I see y'all then, bid you all farewell.